Little Calensham opens its gates to outsiders for just a few hours each day. This gated community is home to the Callum Jewel Emporium and the Garden of Whispers, where people trade secrets in a maze of paper screens, and the Verdashir Academy, known for training adventurers, both spellcasters and warriors. And of course, there's the famous Oasis Theater. You're here for the bazaar, the local market. Merchants from beyond the Sword Coast send their finery, their silks, their steels. Amazing and interesting goods are shipped here to Little Calensham. You are excited by the potential of what could be around each and every corner. All right, guys, what do you do next? So what I just described is the gated community of Little Calensham, part of a much larger city called Baldur's Gate, something we're all familiar with. And if you wanted to run a campaign in Baldur's Gate, Little Calensham not a bad place to start because it's a contained, like I said, gated community. So that would allow you to start with something like this, a little more manageable than this, the huge city that is Baldur's Gate. And that would be a good idea, but the way I did it in that intro presented a lot of cool stuff, but then it just left the players with this very open, probably too open-ended question: what do you do next? And that's often the criticism of Sandbox adventures, that they don't give the players any direction because they are designed to be open world. Now, I consumed a whole bunch of content about sandboxes over the past week, and as you would expect, it's kind of all over the place. There's some good tips out there, but it's also pretty vague. And there's a lot of different language describing the same kinds of things. So I tried to condense it all down into something that would make a little more sense and something that could be then extrapolated to other design goals as well. So these were the three key components that seem to be universal across all the sandbox advice that's out there: not linear, exploration, and choices. So exploration encounters and giving your players choices, that's pretty clear advice. I think that's mostly actionable advice. But describing something by not a thing is not the best definition. So we could replace not linear with open world, but I still don't know how actionable saying make an open world is. And enter Justin Alexander in his book, So You Want to Be a Game Master. And he does a good job of giving actionable steps to this open world idea. So what he recommends is to not plot, to not create a story, because the whole point here is we don't want it to be linear. So you're not designing plots around your NPCs that they will be doing this and they will be doing that. So instead, you create what he calls situation hooks. So these are hooks that don't necessarily drag the players into a story. They're hooks that pull players into a situation, and those situations convey the ideas and intentions of these NPCs. And that fits perfectly with the 4 feuding factions step of my campaign prep process, because the NPCs of those factions can be spread across your game world, and each of them can have a situation. Each of them can have this hook that invites the players to engage with them, and when the players do engage with those NPCs, then they can learn about the factions and the motivation of that faction. And players are clever. They look for connections. They want the game world to make as much sense as you do. They want to believe in this world too. So as you sprinkle in these component parts and these different factions, and the players start to see that this NPC is allied with that NPC, then those factions start to come alive, and your world starts to have that verisimilitude that Matt Colville is always talking about. But you're not force-feeding your players a plot, going from point A to point B to point C in order for the story to make sense. Or in the situation with Wizards of the Coast hardback books, going from Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. Instead, you're engaging the players with these situation hooks, and the players then get to decide which hook they want to engage with and how. That's where the player choice comes in. They can choose how to engage with this hook. They can choose what to do with this NPC. And they can choose this hook over that hook, or choose that NPC over this NPC. And that's how my 4 feuding factions work as well. The players can choose which faction to engage and when. They can choose to engage this faction first because they think they're a bigger threat, or they can choose to engage that faction first because they're the more interesting one. They can try to play 2 factions against each other, or they can try to make an alliance with one of the factions and get them on their side. So now let's take a look at those 3 components of building a sandbox, and we can replace the open world idea with the more actionable situation hook advice. So we have situation hooks, exploration encounters, and player choices. This gives us 3 solid building blocks to really latch onto and keep in our design headspace as we start to build a sandbox and as we create a world for our players to engage with. But when I say everything's a sandbox, isn't that hyperbole? Yeah, it is. However, it's to make the point that once we boil down the key components to building a sandbox to useful, actionable steps, then we can take those steps, those actionable steps, and apply them to all sorts of game design, not just sandbox game design. So like in my last video, everything's a dungeon, we can take the same concepts that we apply to dungeons and apply them to other spaces in the game. We can also take these 3 core concepts from sandboxes and apply those things to other design spaces as well. So we can take these 3 core concepts and apply them to dungeons, for example. So let's take a look. Can we put situation hooks in a dungeon? Of course. We can put NPCs and villains in our dungeon with specific motivations that create specific situations. It's not just a matter of a room with a hobgoblin, a bugbear, and a couple of goblins. The bugbear and the hobgoblin are fighting over some treasure, and the goblins are sitting back watching and betting on who's going to win the argument. That's a situation. So when you peek into the room and the monsters are arguing with each other, you could leave them be and sneak on by. Or if you see them fighting over the treasure, you could try to devise a way to get that treasure by exacerbating their argument, getting the 2 of them to fight each other. Players could come up with all sorts of clever ideas to do in that situation. See, situation hooks, not just monsters in a room with situation in it. So these situation hooks work in a dungeon just as well as they do in a sandbox. Likewise, our exploration step also works well in a dungeon when you start to think about the concept of jquazing the dungeon. The idea that when you design your dungeon, it's not a linear path of one room leading to the next, It's a room of interconnected hallways with multiple different avenues and multiple different directions in which you can go. And all of these things lead up to the key component of any good game, and that's player choice. You want your players to be able to choose and feel like they have options in this game. And that's why video games like Skyrim and Dark Souls and Baldur's Gate 3 are so popular, because they are based on the type of game that we play at our table, the type of game where a dungeon master provides players with multiple choices and then can react accordingly. So these big, awesome video games are taking the ideas from decades of tabletop play, and they're turning that into a style of game that players really love because, again, you feel like you are interacting with this broad, huge world, and you are making a difference in that world. That's what's great about tabletop role-playing games, and that's how the video game industry has capitalized on that. Because ultimately, this all boils down to player choice and feeling important. You want your character to matter, and you want your choices to matter. That's why we play these games. And so this is what I meant when I said everything's a dungeon. You can zoom in on the step-by-step process of making a dungeon to have actionable steps to design dungeons for your table. But once you learn those actionable steps, then you can zoom out and see them as design concepts and apply those concepts to other parts of the game as well. And likewise, today what we did was zoom into the actionable steps of designing a sandbox and then zoom out to see how we can apply those concepts to other parts of the game as well. So now you're building this neural network of design concepts on top of, like an umbrella over your specific step-by-step of dungeon design and sandbox design. So to wrap up, let's look at this sandbox metaphor. What is a sandbox? It's a place where kids play. And what do they play with? Toys. And who do they play with? Friends. And what does a good parent tell their children? Share your toys with your friends. So taking that metaphor as strictly as we can, our Dungeons & Dragons table is a space where we've invited our friends to engage with the things we've created. Our towns, our villages, our dungeons, our monsters, our factions, our villains. Those are all our toys that we've invited our friends to play with. And we're not going to sit back and say, that's not how you do it. We're going to be like, oh, cool. Let's do it that way. And that is the brilliance of everything's a sandbox. This is how you can apply this concept to your games and enjoy the fantastic things that you and your friends are going to build together. Make sure you guys tune in next week because we have official release dates for the 2024 version of Dungeons & Dragons. Make sure you subscribe and ring that bell so that you get notified right away when next week's videos come out, because I am spending all next week going over the new version of Dungeons & Dragons and everything we know so far. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Dire Den.